Hi there, welcome to the Community Policy Forum podcast and to our first podcast episode of 2023. The Community Policy Forum is an independent think tank seeking to promote evidence-based and community-centered approaches to policymaking surrounding the structural inequalities facing Muslim communities in the UK. We attempt this through connecting policymakers with academic research and experts, and through providing platforms for engagement with diverse Muslim voices on areas of contemporary importance. So in a speech in January setting out his 5 key priorities for 2023, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak pledged to pass new laws to stop asylum seekers arriving in the UK on small boats crossing the English Channel. The illegal migration bill, the government says, would prevent migrants arriving in the UK by such means from claiming asylum and allow for them to be detained and subsequently removed from the country. On Tuesday evening at second reading, a majority of MPs voted in favour of the bill, and it is the illegal migration bill that we're going to discuss in a little bit more depth today. So in the first part of today's episode, we're fortunate to be joined by Tommy Shepherd MP. So Tommy is the SNP Member of Parliament for Edinburgh East. He also served as Vice President of the NUS from 1982 to 1984. And in 1986 was elected to Hackney Council, becoming deputy leader of the council 4 years later. In September 2014, he joined the SNP and was elected as the MP for Edinburgh East in 2015. He currently undertakes the role of Shadow SNP spokesperson for Constitutional Affairs. So, Tommy, on Tuesday you voted against the bill. Could you please outline your reasons for opposing this piece of legislation?
Well, because I think it's an horrendous piece of legislation designed to victimize and further oppress some of the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world. It's really quite shameful. And on top of all of that, it's a piece of legislation which I've never seen in my 8 years in Parliament, where the government actually admits in advance that there is a probability that it will break international law. And the bill, if passed in its current form, it effectively makes it illegal to claim asylum in the UK unless you arrive here by one of a very, very small number of approved routes by the government. Anybody who comes in under their own steam and then decides to claim asylum, they will be their claim will simply not be heard. And that is against the Refugee Convention, it's against the European Court of Human Rights principles, and it's probably against the United Nations Charter as well. And it seems that there are backbench MPs who not only are they not worried about that, they seem quite gleeful in picking a fight with international legal bodies. And I mean, the whole situation is out of control and really quite bizarre. So for that and and many other reasons, that's why I and my colleagues and voted against the bill. And I think although it's designed to be sort of red meat for the Tory faithful and the Tory activists, and certainly the polls show that amongst Conservative voters, the bill is very popular. But I think amongst most fair-minded people in this country, they would see this as a shoddy piece of legislation, which isn't even going to achieve the aims that it says it has of stopping people crossing in small boats. It's not going to do that. It's just going to make life an awful lot harder for people who already have it so hard that it's a level of experience and tragedy and horror that thankfully most of us never have to put up with.
Thank you, Tommy. So we're going to come on to in a little bit on the second part of the show, kind of the implications of the bill for asylum seekers and contextualizing that within other policies surrounding immigration of this government. So Tommy, I also wanted to ask yourself, obviously being part of the SNP, an MP based in Edinburgh, what do you see as some of the main implications of the bill for Scotland in particular, particularly in regard to devolved powers?
Yes, well, the biggest part of that would be in terms of under 18-year-olds, where the bill, so it Under 18-year-olds are regarded as children, and providing protection and services for children is a devolved function. It's done through the Scottish Government and a network of local authorities providing social care services. This bill gives the UK government the ability to intervene and interfere in those arrangements when it comes to what they would call illegal migrant children. And of course, you probably know that one of the most odious things in the bill is that if somebody arrives here unaccompanied under 18, say a kid arrives here 10 or 11 years old, they could go to school for 7 years in this country and on their 18th birthday be deported just for turning 18. I mean, it is beyond cruel. And they would be deported, well, presumably they wouldn't be deported back to Iran, for example, if that's where they came from. They might end up going to Rwanda or wherever else the government's got some shoddy detention camp built in foreign parts. So, that is the biggest part. I mean, there's also there are possible implications for devolution in the sense that all of what the devolved authorities do by law has to be compatible with the Human Rights Act and with international human rights obligations. And as I said, there's a high probability that the proposals in this bill will be in conflict with those provisions, and that is going to work through into a legislative conflict in terms of devolved competence than what the UK is trying to do in this area.
Mm. And of course, as we know, the government's on a bit of a warpath to scrap the Human Rights Act through the British Bill of Rights as well. So, Tommy, finally, what do you think would be a better approach than that being pursued by the government in regards to creating safe and legal routes for refugees coming to the UK?
Well, Kazim, I will answer that, but the first to say that this supposed problem of people coming in small boats is one that is entirely of this government's making. And it's happening because they have closed down practically every other way in which people can come into the UK and claim asylum or refugee status. And to give you an example, I mean, the government talks about how it has bilateral agreements to assist people fleeing persecution. And if you take the situation, for example, with Afghanistan, where people have been, there is the Afghan resettlement program, where people can apply if they're fleeing the Taliban to come to this country. In the last year, that scheme relocated 22 people. 22 people. And little wonder, therefore, that 8,500 Afghans are amongst the people who tried to come here in small boats last year. Because if you are fleeing persecution, and if you do speak English and you have got family contact in the UK and that's where you want to come, there is practically no other way to get here except to put your life in the hands of the people smugglers and get into one of these dangerous dinghies on the shores of France. So the most obvious answer to the question of what do you do about this problem is you open up safe and legal routes to allow people to come, and to come at the scale that they need to come not just 22 people, but tens of thousands of people to be admitted each year. And I refute completely the suggestion that this country's full up and cannot accommodate these people. That is absolute nonsense. Britain takes far less than its fair share of refugees across the world. There are many other countries just as populated as we are who make a much, much bigger contribution. And it is our humanitarian duty to open our hearts and our borders to these people. And all of this talk about invasion and being overrun is just xenophobic nonsense designed to try and underpin what is a very cruel policy by dehumanizing the people that it refers to. So that's the answer. You let people come in. Of course, also the answer, it is costing the British taxpayer an absolute fortune to house people in detention camps and in crummy hotels while they spend months, sometimes years, having their application processed. So what you would do there is you would process the applications quickly. There's no reason why they can't be done within 7 to 10 working days. You just staff up and you do it. And while people are waiting for their applications to be processed, don't keep them in camps. Let them into the community and let them get a job and pay their taxes so that they can contribute to this country, which is what, after all, they want to do. So, I mean, it's such a common sense answer to your question, what do you do instead? And that would be much more effective. It would save a lot of money for the British taxpayer. It would be far more humane for the people trying to come here. And it would get rid of the problem. Instead, the government is just whipping up bad ill feeling towards people fleeing persecution, and it isn't going to deal with the problem. It just is not. It's all rhetoric designed for political purposes and nothing else.
Mm. Thank you very much, Tommy, for your time, for taking time out of your busy schedule, no doubt, in order to talk to us about this piece of legislation. I hope that you can also join us again on the podcast soon.
Okay, it's a pleasure, Kazim. Thank you very much.
So for the second part of this episode, we're lucky to be joined by Julia Tinsley-Kent, firstly, who is Policy and Strategic Communications Manager at the Migrants' Rights Network. She specialised in the prevalence of post-colonial discourse in the British media at university and has a qualification in public policy analysis from the London School of Economics, LSE. She also has extensive experience of working with refugees and migrants. Whilst undertaking her undergraduate degree, she co-founded and ran a student-led project which taught refugees English, winning a Pride of Newcastle Award in 2017. She is also currently involved in refugee mentoring and advocacy alongside her role at the Migrants' Rights Network. We're also joined by Hattie Nelligan, who's a fourth-year undergraduate from Singapore studying international relations at the University of St. Andrews. She specializes in post-colonial and decolonial theory, specifically with regards to immigration, citizenship, asylum, and development. She's currently writing her dissertation on the continuity and influence of colonial biases within the construction and implementation of the UK-Rwanda asylum arrangement. So continuing on the discussion that I was having previously with Tommy Shepherd MP, I'd like to come to yourself first, Julie, and ask you if you can please provide a little bit more of a background as to where this bill has come from.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important to say that this bill, it didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't a surprise. We knew it was coming, or something like it was coming. I think it's important to say, I mean, we have seen increasingly hostile and restrictive immigration policies, particularly under the Conservative government. But I mean, they were building on a foundation that had been built by Labour, and then also we have in the UK for decades had quite conservative views towards immigration. So the building blocks have been there, and the anti-refugee, anti-migrant sentiment has been steadily growing, but I think particularly since 2015, 2016 in the Brexit referendum, immigration took centre stage. During that, I think lots of us remember that horrible Breaking Point poster that Nigel Farage stood in front of, and I don't think we can underestimate the damage that did in sowing a lot of these ideas that have come to the forefront of how we speak about immigration, but specifically people crossing the channel in small boats. So I mean, the bill, we got a sense that it was coming at the end of last year when Rishi Sunak stood up in Parliament and he delivered his 5 points on how he was going to be tougher on refugee and migration policy. And they did hint then that something tougher was on the horizon. And I mean, we thought when we saw the Nationality and Borders Act come through and the Rwanda plan, we thought, how much worse could it get? And again, the government have surprised us with just what they are willing to say or try and get through Parliament.
Thank you for that, Julia. So just staying with yourself for a moment. So as an activist and as somebody also that has worked directly and extensively with refugees, and I asked Tommy this sort of same question, but what are your views on the bill?
I think it's concern but not shock that it happened. I think it's concerning that we have government ministers, media, and public attitude that is so sort of willing to kind of stand up and openly say that this does clash with a lot of our refugee protection obligations and seem to not really care that that's the case. That concerns me. It concerns me that the rhetoric that we've seen building and how we view refugees and how we view migrants has moved to such a hostile place and such a divisive place that this bill seems palatable, that we are seemingly very content to deport people who are fleeing war, persecution, famine, poverty, that the humanity of how we look at migration and refugee protection has moved so far that this is seen as a good idea and is seen as something that people are happy to be passed through Parliament, and that it will, you know, Monday night it was 312 votes in favour. And I think I know full well how we've got to this point, but the fact that we have is really concerning. But also, if you have been in this space for such a long time and you've seen the way that it's moved and you've seen the impact that it's had on people, and I've worked with lots of politicians and I've worked with lots of political activists from cross-party. You've seen that this was coming on the horizon. It doesn't make it any less sad that this is the position that we're in. And I think even if the Conservative government is voted out, you know, there's an election on the horizon, we're also in a position where the opposition to it isn't that it is horrific and that it's heinous and that it is completely inhumane how we're willing to treat people so cruelly. The main opposition to it is this is not going to work and you're not being tough enough and it's not going to crack down on the people smugglers. That is so utterly disappointing, that we have reached this point where we've shifted so far to the right. And I wonder if we end up with a Labour government and we end up with a Labour coalition government, what are we going to have to do to undo the damage that's been done to those people, but also how these ideas have been sown into our collective consciousness and value system? I think that's going to be a much bigger piece of work, but also the fact that we, as a country that likes to see itself as this beacon of human rights, and we see this in our foreign policy rhetoric that Britain is often condemning other countries for their human rights record, and we can talk about the legacy and history of colonialism for hours, but how we could move to this point, and I think remembering that we are very capable of doing this to people is something that I think we should be worried about, and that we should really stop and pause and question why that is.
Thanks, Julia. So I'll come back to yourself in a second to sort of speak about the kind of wider impacts of government rhetoric and policy and public attitudes when it comes to asylum seekers. But I wanted to first ask Hattie, and obviously coming sort of off what Julia said in terms of the backdrop within which this bill has come forward. Could you please sort of speak a little bit more to the links that you think can be drawn between this particular bill and the government's wider policies on immigration?
Yeah, so I think, as Julia said, there is just like legacies of hostile immigration policies, and from the Nationality Acts in the 80s, keeping intentionally aimed to keep Commonwealth citizens who were, meant to be British nationals no longer have their nationality as British, and instead, bar their kind of access to the wealth that has been created through the empire, and then moving all the way into, the Rwanda policy introduced by Priti Patel. And I think all of that is just kind of, the main links are these policies of exclusion that just keep on barring non-white, these people deemed undesirable or, undeserving by these policies. And just barring them from any kind of resistance as well. Like like Julia was saying, the complete inhumanity they're treated with, it's, they're kind of being reduced so forcefully to this very, people have talked about, the state of limbo, the permanent state of limbo, as they're left in hotel detention and, asylum processing centers. Obviously there's a lot of resistance, but it is just so hard and so in such a hostile environment. And the fact that, we're talking about the policies in the opposition, the policies are, ineffective, but looking more under that is kind of looking at, they're putting this blame, all of these policies, they're putting the blame onto these asylum seekers who are not responsible for the failure of the asylum system. Just as Julia said, the boats are not the problem. The boats are just a symptom of the complete failures of the system, the huge backlog in waiting times, stuff like that, and not providing any actual safe and legal routes as instead of I think the UK, to claim asylum in the UK, you need to be on British soil, but you can't come onto it without having already an asylum claim. So there's not actually any way to claim asylum unless you're recognized in your region as a refugee. So so just kind of all of these failures of the Home Office and the government is just being put onto asylum seekers who are not the cause of the problem at all. Yeah.
Thank you, Hattie. Thank you for that answer. If you don't mind, if I just stay with you for a second, obviously you're kind of, writing on the UK Rwanda asylum arrangement. Could you just speak a little bit more to that, and perhaps where you feel this bill fits in order to, I guess, strengthen that policy that has been existent since sort of Priti Patel was Home Secretary?
Yeah, so the Rwanda asylum arrangement is basically framed as this economic development partnership between the UK and Rwanda, but it's essentially pretty similar practice to this. Anyone who's coming irregularly, their claims are deemed inadmissible if they've come through an irregular passage and they've come through a safe country, and that means that they're able to be deported to Rwanda for their asylum claims to be processed there. And that, I think just this obviously that's been stalled in the courts, and I think people are saying it, they're not really thinking it's going to be able to go ahead until a year at least. But this just kind of seems like the same thing, but just phrased in a different way and much more not really hiding from it in terms of migration, economic development with Rwanda, or any kind of the saviorism that they usually associate with this. This one is very much making it much more clear that they're seeing asylum seekers as a threat and as a criminal problem that needs to be addressed now. Yeah.
Thank you, Hattie. So Julia, coming back to yourself, and you touched on this before, but I'd like to kind of flesh that out a little bit more. What impact have government policies and the rhetoric of particular ministers had on public attitudes towards asylum seekers here in the UK?
Yeah, I think it's worth just drawing something that Hattie said, and I think this this emphasis that we have on small boats and refugees, asylum seekers, is part of it's a classic exercise in scapegoating, right? The living standards in the UK have dropped, huge waiting times, cost of living crisis. The only thing that the government really have to stand on is this small boats issue and is the culture war. It is a distraction technique, and I know from a good source of mine that Labour have been advised really not to kind of fall for this, get drawn into these conversations about small boats and the culture war, because it is purely a distraction technique by the government to stop us questioning their record over the last 13 years. But I mean, in terms of how this rhetoric is impacting the people that we work with, but also how it's being used by the far right or people, the general public. I mean, I was speaking to a friend of mine, and he's also a volunteer at MRN, and he's in home office accommodation at the moment. And he said, you fall asleep every night listening to the sound of people crying because they have come to the UK and are just made to feel so unwelcome. And these are all single men of colour that have come here on their own, and they are the number one public enemy at the moment. And there are multiple reasons why these people have been framed in that way. It's the people who are crossing the channel are predominantly people of colour. They've come from countries like Syria, Afghanistan. They tend to be Muslim, and are, as Hattie mentioned, are characterised as a threat to whatever we assume British culture is. I would argue British culture doesn't really exist, but they are being framed as a threat to communities along with the queer community, trans people, drag queens, so on. But it is affecting their sense of belonging, and not just asylum seekers as well. It's also migrant and migrantized communities. I'm sure you know full well from the work that you do is a lot of this rhetoric is being aimed at Muslim communities to alienate them. But also as well, we are seeing a lot of the language that the government ministers and a lot of the media are using, like invasion. We are often and increasingly at MRN being inundated with people echoing that language to attack us and the people we work with and our stance. It was only yesterday we had people saying they're an invasion, they're illegal, but also drawing on this idea, this quite Orientalist view of Muslim men of colour being threats to British white women and girls. And I think that is an immediate reflection of a lot of the rhetoric we've seen. It's always single men coming here that are being demonized. They are very much a lot of the targets. We see that it's sort of an exceptionalism to people who are challenging this bill, saying, oh, we want to protect children and women, and of course we do, but we also want to protect everyone. So I think we are seeing this language take a huge hold, and I think that's why we started the Words Matter campaign at the Migrants' Rights Network, because when Russia invaded the Ukraine, why were people from the Ukraine given such different treatment to people who are forced to cross the channel? And I think it is testament to what our immigration system is about and who we deem to be welcome in the UK, and the rhetoric is a direct reflection of that.
Thank you, Julia. So coming back to yourself, Hattie, and probably kind of, I guess, to start to wrap up now, but looking at the kind of wider picture, the case of Shamima Vegan has also been sort of quite prominent this past month or so. Could you please tell us a little bit more about that case, but also how you feel it's embedded within this wider agenda of the government and this wider discussion around immigration, citizenship, racialization, migrantization, and those sort of other aspects that we've drawn on today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Shamima Begum, just like a bit more background, but she's trafficked to Syria when she was 15, and joined the Islamic State, and then stripped of her British citizenship. The Home Secretary said that because she had access to Bangladeshi citizenship through her mother, even though she'd never been there, and she didn't actually have it, and the government, the Bangladeshi government, had, said she was not a citizen. That meant that they were able to strip her of her nationality and make her not technically stateless. And again, I think it was last month, lost her appeal, despite the judge recognizing that it was likely that she had been trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation. So I think just what we could see from that case is, it's very much just within this wider agenda of criminalization of non-white populations, and those hierarchical notions, humanity, and then relating that into citizenship. So in terms of asylum, we obviously see people who have even been granted asylum, and they've got naturalized citizens, but they have no recourse to public funds, or they're not provided with any kind of welfare assistance after their application, and after their successful application, and any sort of criminal conviction, no matter how small, or without kind of considering any sort of circumstances, makes their citizenship very, very precarious as well. And then in a similar vein, but with non-white citizens with British citizenship from birth, that's the only citizenship they've ever had, even if they have access again to dual nationality through family ties. That means that citizenship is precarious, insecure from birth, and often is premised upon this performance of, like Julia said, British values, which we're not really, I don't even know what British values are, but this performance of them, and the trope of like good Muslim, bad Muslim, where goodness is associated with whiteness and Westernness and stuff like that. And obviously all of this, very grounded in Orientalism, and seeing non-white populations, especially men, as a threat. So I think especially the response to Shamima Begum in the case, considering that the judge, saw that she was groomed and trafficked for sexual exploitation, and the response of the Home Secretary and the politicians compared to the response of them to the construction of the grooming gangs, and the threat of them towards white British girls, despite countless stuff that's been written about it, where it's showing very much that this is a very constructed threat.
Thank you, Hattie. I'm sure that kind of particular conversation around citizenship and Shamima Begum is certainly something that perhaps we can delve into a little bit more next time, as it is quite an extensive discussion. As is sort of the discussion as a whole that we've had today, I think this won't be the last discussion that any of us kind of have, within our line of work and research and education. On this particular piece of legislation, it's just gone through a second reading in the Commons, so there is some way still for the bill to go before becoming law. So we're going to kind of keep track of that. I would ask that sort of everyone that is listening, make sure you please follow Migrants' Rights Network on Twitter and on Instagram and all those kind of social media platforms to stay updated about the status of this legislation, and also kind of to keep updated and to kind of keep abreast of all the discussions and debates within this very, very important space. Please also make sure that you follow the Community Policy Forum on Twitter and on Instagram and on LinkedIn. And do keep up with the brilliant work of Julia and of Hattie on social media and through kind of your preferred platforms. I'd like to just once again thank all of our guests, Tommy Sheppard MP, who joined us earlier in this episode, Julia Tinsley-Kent and Hattie Nelligan, for sort of giving up your time in what no doubt has been a very hectic and very busy period for us all these past number of days and weeks. But yeah, no, thank you to you guys, and thank you to all of our listeners as well. Do watch this space for the continuation of our podcast this year, and for our next episode, which should be out soon. Thank you very much.